In the fall of 1871, what began as a routine property dispute in a quiet corner of rural Pennsylvania unraveled into one of the most unsettling medical scandals in American history. County officers had arrived at the secluded settlement of Harmonia Springs to deliver eviction notices, expecting to find a few stubborn tenants. Instead, they stepped into a scene of eerie abandonment. 23 homes stood empty, their doors hanging open, belongings scattered as if their owners had fled in haste. At the heart of the settlement was a strange medical complex, filled with meticulous records 15 years' worth detailing a program of organized human experimentation. Outside, the earth was disturbed by countless graves. Many belonged. 2 children whose skeletal remains bore grotesque deformities unlike anything local physicians had ever documented. Among the scattered papers lay a small, weathered journal belonging to a woman named Sarah Brennan. Her final entry, written in a shaky hand, contained only 5 chilling words: "We were brother and sister." Those words would echo through the minds of investigators for decades. What had taken place in Harmonia Springs between 1856 and 1871 was so deliberate, so morally corrupt, that 3 separate congressional inquiries sought to suppress the truth, not to protect the public from harm, but to shield them from knowledge deemed dangerous for public morality. The origins of Harmonia Springs, however, were deceptively hopeful. In 1856, Pennsylvania was gripped by hardship and instability. The rapid industrial expansion had displaced thousands, leaving them injured, unemployed, and impoverished. In Schuylkill County's anthracite coal fields, mining accidents were a grim, regular occurrence, sometimes claiming lives weekly. Medical knowledge of the time, still primitive and ignorant of basic sanitation, offered little beyond crude interventions like bloodletting. In the cities, factory workers in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia suffered in dim, suffocating mills, losing fingers to unguarded machinery, inhaling fibers that rotted their lungs, and working themselves into early graves. It was into this bleak landscape that Dr. Cornelius Engelhardt appeared, promising something that sounded like salvation. He was nothing like the local physicians who clung to old remedies and superstition. Instead of offering mercury pills or leeches for every ailment, he spoke of groundbreaking European techniques, modern science, and treatments that could not only heal but perfect the human body. Engelhardt was an imposing figure, 6 feet tall, his prematurely white hair giving him the air of a seasoned statesman. His voice carried a quiet authority that made even skeptical farmers lean in when he spoke. His background sounded impeccable. A graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School in 1835, time spent studying under famed European physiologists, a year working with Rudolf Virchow in Berlin, and articles published in obscure but impressive-sounding medical journals. Engelhardt first appeared in Lancaster in the spring of 1856, taking a room at the White Swan Inn on King Street. He attended local medical society meetings, listening politely to discussions on humoral theory before rising to deliver passionate lectures on the new science of heredity. He referenced Gregor Mendel's work with pea plants knowledge, so ahead of its time that most in America would not hear of it for another decade. He described experiments in bloodline refinement, supposedly underway in the most advanced sanitariums of Europe, and unlike other doctors in the area, Engelhardt had the wealth to make his visions a reality without a moment's haggling. He purchased 800 acres of fertile farmland along the banks of Connoy Creek, about 15 miles northwest of Lancaster. The land had belonged to the Hare family for generations, but repeated crop failures and mounting debt had forced them to sell. For Engelhardt, the site was ideal, remote enough to work without interference from conventional medical authorities, yet close enough to the newly built railroad line linking Lancaster and Harrisburg to ensure discreet transportation of supplies or patients. The property even featured a natural limestone spring, clear and cold, that bubbled up from the earth. For the settlers he soon attracted, it was a symbol of purity and renewal. For Engelhardt, it was the beginning of something far more sinister. Beneath the rocky ground, the water carried a faint whiff of sulfur, a scent Dr. Engelhardt insisted was proof of its healing qualities. By his account, The minerals within could restore health to the sick and strengthen the weak. It wasn't. Long before the quiet valley transformed into a construction site, Englehart brought in laborers from Lancaster German and Irish men, who were paid generously for their work, though their contracts demanded total silence about the project. Rising in the center of the settlement was the main medical building, a three-story brick structure crowned with a cupola larger and more ornate than what most hospitals of the day could boast. Around it, laid out in a strict geometric arrangement that Englehart claimed was vital for harmonic living, stood the foundations for 36 houses. Each home was identical to Story's, with 4 rooms on each floor, indoor water pumps, and a ventilation system that seemed almost futuristic for the mid-1800s. The first families arrived in March of 1857, their heavy coats still drawn tight against a stubborn cold snap that had frozen the creek into a slab of glass. They had been handpicked by Englehart himself. His advertisements, printed in Pennsylvania's German-language newspapers, promised a miracle, revolutionary treatments at no cost, comfortable housing, steady work, and care for your ailments, especially for children. Letters flooded in from desperate parents across the state. They wrote of clubfoot, hair-lip, seizures, mental impairments, and other conditions medicine of the time could neither cure nor explain. Yet Englehart's selections were puzzling. He rejected a wealthy merchant's family from Philadelphia, but welcomed the poor Zimmermans of Berks County. He turned away a veteran who had lost an arm in war, yet accepted the Grabers, whose teenage daughters suffered from violent seizures. The Zimmermans arrived first. Johannes, his wife Catherine, and their 4 children. Their youngest, Peter, had been born with severe rickets that left his legs so twisted he could barely walk. Years of failed treatments had drained the family's savings braces forged by a blacksmith. Spoonfuls of cod liver oil, even an agonizing surgery in Philadelphia that worsened the damage. When Englehart examined Peter, his hands moved over the boy's bowed legs with such unexpected tenderness that Catherine broke down in tears. He declared Peter's condition entirely curable through nutrition and his own invention, a bone-stretching apparatus, unlike anything the Zimmermans had seen. Soon after came the Grabers, their wagon piled with the last of their belongings. 16-year-old Anna was pale, beautiful despite the strain that lined her face, and had endured seizures since the age of 12. A minister back home had whispered that her illness was God's punishment for hidden sins, a cruelty that drove her father to rage. Englehart waved off such superstition. Anna's problem, he said, was merely an electrical imbalance in the brain, treatable with carefully measured galvanic currents. By summer, 15 families had settled in Harmonia Springs. The Hirschbergers from York County, whose 3 children all struggled with what Englehart called hereditary mental weakness. The Yoders from Chester County, hiding from the cruel gossip about their daughter's severe cleft palate. The Stoltzfus family, the Weavers, the Pennypackers, all of them burdened by the weight of illness and humiliation. For these parents, the offer wasn't just about medicine, it was about dignity. In the outside world, their children were pointed at, whispered about, or pitied as cursed. Here, they were patients, pioneers in a new age of science. The adults, many reduced to begging before they came, were given meaningful workmen in the fields and workshops, women in gardens, and the infirmary. Wages were small but steady, and housing, food, and care were all provided. At first, it all seemed to work exactly as promised. The mineral-rich water did ease some ailments. Children, who had arrived frail and colorless, began to look healthier. Peter Zimmerman's legs showed slight improvement under daily use of the stretching machine and exercises. Anna Graber's seizures became less frequent, her color returning. The Yoder girl's cleft palate was repaired by Englehart in a procedure shockingly advanced for 1857, crude by modern standards, but miraculous then. Yet life in Harmonia Springs came with unyielding rules. Families rarely left without written permission. Mail was intercepted to spare patients unnecessary distress. Visitors were barred unless Englehart approved them in advance. He insisted these measures were vital to protect health and progress. But the most striking policy was what he called the program of hereditary optimization. Every Tuesday evening, the community gathered in the meeting hall to hear Englehart speak. He stood before charts and diagrams, his voice burning with conviction. Most human illness, he claimed, was caused by bloodline contamination, generations of misguided unions that mixed incompatible hereditary traits. He believed in correcting this through carefully arranged marriages. The first such wedding took place on September 15, 1858, more than a year after the settlement's founding. A delay, he said, required for his studies to determine the ideal pairings. The chosen couple was 18-year-old Sarah Graber and 21-year-old William Brennan. Englehart declared them the perfect blend of hereditary strengths. Sarah, once sickly, was transformed. Her seizures had vanished months before. Her frame had filled out. Her cheeks were rosy. She carried herself with a grace no longer shadowed by the fear of sudden collapse. She worked in the settlement's small schoolhouse, helping teach the younger children, her life now a model of what Englehart promised for all. Charlotte Penny Packer spent her mornings patiently, guiding the youngest children of Harmonia Springs through their letters and numbers. When the sun dipped low, she would return home and sit on the porch with her parents. Her mother, Elizabeth, would braid her long auburn hair while her father, Jacob, read aloud from the Bible in his calm, steady voice, a sound that seemed to settle the world around them. William Brennan's journey had been no less extraordinary. He had arrived in Harmonia Springs during the summer of 1857, brought by a distant relation who had heard of Dr. Englehart's remarkable treatments. His early life had been a tale of quiet misfortune. His parents had died when he was just 7, supposedly taken by a cholera outbreak in Philadelphia. Left in the care of an aunt in Chester County who struggled to feed herself, William grew up thin, frail, and plagued by chronic breathing troubles. Any labor more demanding than a few hours left him weak and gasping for air. But under Englehart's experimental regimen, daily vapor inhalations, and rhythmic chest percussion, his health improved dramatically. Within months, he was strong enough to work full days in the carpentry shop, shaping wood with the steady skill of a craftsman who had been denied the chance to use his hands for too long. The relationship between William and Sarah had not grown by accident. It had been meticulously arranged by Englehart. He paired them for settlement tasks, cataloging books in the medical library, tending the herb gardens, teaching Sunday school together. In his private journal, Englehart recorded his observations like a scientist noting the progress of a trial. How William set aside the finest scraps of wood to carve small gifts for Sarah. How Sarah brought him pastries from her mother's kitchen. When he finally announced their engagement during one of his Tuesday lectures, he presented it as a triumph of his theories. With charts, measurements, and phrenological diagrams, he claimed proof that the two were an ideal genetic match, physically complementary, temperamentally harmonious, with an excellent probability of producing healthy offspring. The families of the settlement, eager for hope, accepted it without question. That the wedding day broke clear and cool, rare for September in Pennsylvania. The settlement's women had been working for weeks to prepare. Proud Zimmerman sewed Sarah's white cotton gown from fabric Englehart had specially ordered from Philadelphia, embellishing it with seed pearls that shimmered when she moved. The Hirschberger women baked enough pastries for twice the guests they expected, using precious sugar and flour from their limited stores. Even the children, many bearing visible reminders of their illnesses, wore their best clothes and were carefully instructed in how to behave. The meeting hall was transformed into a space of warmth and color, filled with garlands of goldenrod, asters, and chrysanthemums from the gardens. Englehart himself presided over the ceremony, having secured ordination from an obscure sect called the Church of Human Perfectibility, and known to the settlement's Lutheran and Reformed families, but accepted in good faith. His speech on the sanctity of marriage and the blessing of children moved many to tears. Charlotte Penny Packer played the organ gifted by a benefactor from Lancaster, filling the air with hymns that swelled against the rafters. Sarah walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her white dress and rose crown making her seem like a figure from a dream. William waited in a new black suit tailored by the settlement's craftsman, his hands shaking as she drew closer. The vows were familiar except for one unusual addition. After promising to love, honor, and cherish one another, they also pledged to uphold the sacred principles of hereditary science and to raise their children according to the laws of natural optimization. At the time, most took it as just another of Englehart's odd convictions, like his daily mineral baths or his ban on certain contaminated foods. That evening, while music and laughter carried on in the meeting hall, Englehart withdrew to his office and wrote a private note in his journal. The first phase of Experiment Series 3 had been successfully launched. Subjects 3A Sarah and 3B William had been joined in marriage without suspecting the truth, that they were fraternal twins, separated when they were just over a year old. Their different upbringings and the physical changes shaped by them had hidden the resemblance well enough to avoid recognition. The next step, he wrote, would be reproduction, which would yield essential data on concentrated bloodlines. He predicted the first child within 18 months. As a wedding gift, the newlyweds were given a modest 2-story house at the eastern edge of the settlement, with a clear view of the creek. William had spent weeks building and furnishing it, fashioning a cradle by hand and setting it in the upstairs bedroom in quiet expectation of a child. Sarah arranged their belongings with care, hanging curtains sewn by her mother, placing her Bible on the bedside table, and organizing William's tools in neat rows in his workshop. They were young, hopeful, and certain that their life together would be blessed. It wasn't long before the first signs of trouble appeared. Sarah conceived just 2 months after the wedding, something Englehart hailed as proof of their compatibility. But the pregnancy was marked by relentless sickness. She endured constant nausea, pounding headaches that left her in bed for days, and disturbing spells where she stared blankly for hours, unmoved by William's worried voice or touch. On June 21st, 1859, the summer solstice, Sarah gave birth. After a grueling 36-hour labor, her cries echoed across the settlement. Charlotte Penny Packer, serving as midwife, realized something was terribly wrong the moment the child's head emerged. It was abnormally large, misshapen in a way that made her hands tremble as she guided the infant into the world. ****. The infant's arrival into the world was not the joyful moment his parents had hoped for. It was a shock steeped in dread. The baby's head was disturbingly elongated, narrowing into a cone-like shape with a pronounced ridge running straight along the top. His mismatched eyes, one a deep brown like Sarah's, the other a pale, shifting gray-green like William's, moved independently, each wandering in its own direction, giving his gaze an eerie, unfocused quality. But the most unsettling sight was his hands. His fingers were fused together, forming blunt, paddle-like shapes that Charlotte had to carefully cut apart with a scalpel, while the newborn screamed in agony. Dr. Englehart's reaction to the sight of this malformed child was nothing like the concern or compassion expected of a physician. Instead, he was visibly delighted, eyes bright, lips curled in fascination as he measured the baby's skull with metal calipers, meticulously recording every abnormality in his private charts. He assured the distraught parents that these peculiarities were simply hereditary variations and could be corrected over time with his guidance. His prescription was a peculiar blend of treatments: regular skull massage, electrical stimulation, and feeding formulas of his own invention, all prepared in the secrecy of his laboratory. But as the months passed, the disturbing truth emerged: Thomas was not the only child in Harmonia Springs to suffer such strange afflictions. Between 1859 and 1860, several births followed the same chilling pattern. The Zimmerman twins, Eva and Emma, arrived in January 1860, each bearing identical spinal deformities that left them in constant pain, their piercing, unending cries echoing through the settlement every night. That spring, the Yoda family's son was born with such a severe cleft palate that he couldn't nurse. Englehart installed a feeding tube directly into his stomach. Later that year, the Hirschberger family's baby girl was born with limbs twisted into grotesque shapes, her joints bending the wrong way as if her body had been assembled in defiance of anatomy itself. Death became the shadow looming over Harmonia Springs. Of the 12 children born between 1859 and 1861, more than half, 7, died before their first birthdays. The death certificates, signed by Englehart, listed vague causes: hereditary insufficiency, constitutional weakness, failure to thrive. The little hillside cemetery above the settlement grew crowded with tiny headstones, each marking a heartbreak that spanned only weeks or months. Parents often gathered there at dusk, speaking in hushed voices when they were certain Englehart's assistants weren't near. They whispered their fears. What if it wasn't nature or poor genetics killing their children? What if the doctor's so-called treatments were doing the damage? Yet Englehart always had an explanation ready. The suffering, he claimed, was the result of deep genetic flaws that could not be fixed in one generation. Patience was needed. Continued breeding was essential. Perfection, he assured them, would come. Sarah's second pregnancy in late 1860 proved even more harrowing than her first. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Plagued by strange hallucinations, visions of children she insisted were in the room, voices softly calling her name from empty spaces. More than once, William woke to find her standing at the window in the dead of night, silent tears streaking her cheeks, staring into the darkness as though waiting for something unseen. When pressed, she admitted she didn't understand what was happening to her, only that she felt something within her was broken, as if her body itself was turning against her. On March 15, 1861, their second child, Margaret Brennan, was born. The country beyond their remote valley was descending into the chaos of civil war. But within Harmonia Springs, another kind of horror unfolded. Margaret survived for only 3 months. Englehart tried everything in his arsenal, growing increasingly frantic, but the child's frail body simply could not go on. Her deformities were so profound that Charlotte Penny Packer, a woman long hardened by years of medical work, broke down and wept as she prepared the infant for burial. Official records blamed hereditary insufficiency, but in her private notes, Charlotte wrote something far more unsettling: that the baby's internal organs had been strangely misplaced, as though nature had forgotten the correct order in which to arrange them. The Civil War brought Englehart unexpected advantages. He began receiving shipments of children from war-torn regions, orphans, he claimed, whose parents had been killed in the fighting. He told the settlement these children would thrive in their wholesome environment and in time would be integrated into his breeding program. But the truth was darker. Many of these children were not orphans at all. They had been bought or taken from desperate families, chosen for specific physical traits Englehart believed would advance his experiments. To such children arrived in the summer of 1865. Daniel, 7 years old, came first in June, followed by 5-year-old Rebecca in August. Both were said to be survivors of the bloody fighting near Gettysburg. Daniel was placed with the Stoltz family, who had recently lost a child to one of the settlement's recurring mysterious fevers. Rebecca was sent to live with the Weavers, far across town. Englehart was adamant they be kept apart, insisting that children who had endured great trauma must form fresh bonds, rather than cling to memories of shared loss. But Charlotte, with her sharp eye and long memory, noticed something troubling in Englehart's files. Both children were marked with the same cryptic classification, specimen group 7 paired. When she asked about it, Englehart's calm facade cracked. His voice rose in anger as he accused her of meddling in affairs beyond her understanding. He even threatened to expel her from the settlement entirely. Charlotte had been there since the very beginning. Brought in from Philadelphia, where she had trained as a nurse at Pennsylvania Hospital. She was 35 now, unmarried, her life given wholly to medicine at a time when such a path was rare for women. In the early years, she had admired Englehart, his intellect, his conviction that science could banish human suffering. But years of watching malformed infants struggle to breathe, years of seeing parents bury child after child, had stripped away her faith in him. And late at night, when the settlement was quiet and the lanterns burned low, Charlotte found herself wondering not whether Englehart was wrong but whether he had ever truly meant to heal anyone at all. While Dr. Englehart immersed himself in the secretive work of his basement laboratory, Charlotte quietly began her own covert investigation. She meticulously copied his records, building a hidden archive stashed beneath loose floorboards in her quarters. Her search took her deeper into unsettling truths: purchase orders from orphanages, receipts that reduced children to commodities labeled as specimens, and letters exchanged with other physicians, conducting similar grim experiments in different states. Then came the spring of 1868, bringing two events that began to crack open Englehart's carefully maintained feuille. The first was an outbreak of an illness he called hereditary fever, though in reality, it was almost certainly a devastating blend of measles and scarlet fever, carried in by a new family from Harrisburg. In an ordinary town, such diseases would have been troubling, but containable. In Harmonia Springs, where years of deliberate inbreeding had left children with almost no immune defenses, the results were catastrophic. The sickness, as such illnesses often do, claimed the young first. Little Eva Zimmerman fell ill before anyone else. Her frail body was consumed by fever. Her skin blistered with a rash so fierce it resembled burns. Within days, her twin, Emma, succumbed to the same symptoms. Then came the Yoda children, the Hirschberger infant, young Thomas Brennan. One by one, the settlement's children were struck down. Englehart's solution was to quarantine the infected in the medical facility, claiming it was necessary to stop the contagion. Parents were barred from visiting, told that their presence would distress the children and hinder recovery. But Charlotte, assigned to nurse the sick, saw what was really happening. The doctor was exploiting the outbreak to push his experiments further, testing compounds on the dying, recording their agony with cold precision. 17 children died in just 3 weeks. The youngest was barely half a year old, the oldest only 8. Their small bodies were wrapped in white sheets and buried together in a mass grave, which Englehart justified as the only way to halt the spread of disease. Families who had already endured the loss of multiple children weren't even allowed to say their final goodbyes. The grief that descended on Harmonia Springs was suffocating, a tangible heaviness that clung to every home. For Jacob Zimmerman, it was too much to bear. All 4 of his children were gone, including the twins whose difficult birth had been followed by short, pain-filled lives. On the night of May 15, 1868, grief gave way to determination. Jacob slipped through the window of Englehart's office, intent on uncovering the truth. Methodical by nature, a skill honed from his days as a bookkeeper for a Lancaster merchant, he began a systematic search of the doctor's files. The first ledger seemed ordinary at first glance, routine medical notes, observations, treatment logs, but the further he read, the more the language betrayed its sinister meaning. Breeding pairs were labeled by numbers instead of names. Dates marked hereditary confluence achieved aligned with marriage records in the settlement. The most disturbing entries were those for redundant specimens, children who had died or been born with deformities too severe to survive. Then he unfolded a massive genealogical chart that took up an entire wall. At first, it looked like a standard family tree of Harmonia Springs, but as Jacob traced the lines, his horror grew. Names appeared repeatedly in different places, linked by colored lines that seemed to indicate different types of relationships. He saw Sarah Graber and William Brennan connected as husband and wife in blue ink, but also joined by a red line that led back to a shared origin labeled Specimen Group 3. Twin separation experiment. Shaking, Jacob forced open a locked drawer and found more damning evidence. Adoption records from orphanages across Pennsylvania bore Englehart's handwritten notes, gold assessments such as male, 18 months, strong Saxon features suitable for Group 3 breeding, female infant, parentage unknown, physical traits consistent with Group 3 requirements. There were even purchase orders listing children with exact prices, as if they were cattle. The most incriminating documents were real birth certificates hidden behind forged ones. They revealed that children raised in different families told they were unrelated orphans from distant towns were in fact siblings. One certificate from Philadelphia, dated March 3, 1840, confirmed that Sarah Graber and William Brennan were twins, born to Mary Elizabeth Brennan, separated at just over a year old, and sold to different families instructed to maintain the lie. Footsteps in the hallway made Jacob freeze. He gathered the most critical papers, folding them and tucking them into his coat before climbing back out the window. But Englehart was quick to notice the intrusion: an oil lamp still burning, papers out of place. By morning, he had crafted a cover story. The settlement was told that Jacob Zimmerman had suffered a mental collapse from grief and had been sent to the state asylum in Harrisburg. to spare him criminal charges for supposedly attacking the doctor. Commitment was presented as the only option. No one in Harmonia Springs saw Jacob again. Months later, Catherine Zimmerman received a letter claiming her husband had died of brain fever. She didn't recognize the handwriting as Englehart's, or perhaps she did but was too shattered to care. Charlotte, however, had seen everything from her window the moment Jacob slipped into the office. The way he ran off with his coat stuffed full of papers. She knew her own time was running short. That night, she gathered her secret cache of copied records. But there was one last thing she needed to do before acting, warn Sarah Brennan. It was just after sunset on May 20, 1868, when Charlotte reached Sarah's house. Sarah was alone. William had been sleeping in the workshop, unable to face the rooms where two of their children had died. Upstairs, their surviving son, Thomas, now 9, wheezed heavily in his sleep. Sarah, 6 months pregnant with her 4th child, looked utterly worn, her body swollen, her face hollowed by relentless grief. "I have to tell you something," Charlotte murmured, her eyes flicking toward the windows. "About your husband. About both of you. About what Dr. Englehart has done." Sarah's first impulse was to refuse. She had survived by not probing too deeply, by swallowing Englehart's explanations, by convincing herself that her children's deformities were simply God's will or nature's cruelty, not the result of something far darker. Charlotte's urgency pierced through Sarah's carefully built walls. The older woman's trembling hands pulled a stack of papers from her bag, her tear-streaked face tight with desperation. First came the birth certificate. Mary Elizabeth Brennan listed as mother, twins born on March 3, 1840, at Philadelphia General Hospital. 1 boy and 1 girl. Then came the adoption files, 2 different families, 2 separate stories, yet the same date of placement and the same bold signature, Dr. Cornelius Englehart. Charlotte's voice shook as she clutched Sarah's hands. "You and William are twins," she said. "Englehart separated you as infants, gave you to strangers, then brought you back together to marry. The deformities in your children, it's because you share the same blood. You are not only husband and wife, you are brother and sister." Sarah didn't scream or collapse as Charlotte had braced herself for. She simply stilled, her hands instinctively resting on her swollen belly, where another child, another consequence of this twisted arrangement, was growing. When her voice finally emerged, it was a faint whisper. "I think I've always known. Something was wrong. The way Thomas looks at me, his eyes aren't just like William's. They're exactly his eyes. And Margaret, before she died, her hands were identical to mine, right down to the birthmark on her smallest finger. Even the way William laughs, it's the same sound I make. I thought that meant we were soulmates, made for each other by God. But it wasn't God, was it?" In the weeks that followed, the truth infected Harmonia Springs like a sickness no one could contain. Charlotte's papers, passed to Sarah, found their way to Mary Yoda, who shared them with her sister-in-law, who whispered them to the Weaver women during laundry day. Every revelation was worse than the last. The Stoltzfus family learned their 3 adopted children were all siblings. The Hirschbergers discovered the cousin they had taken in was their own son, stolen at birth and returned to them years later disguised as an orphan. When William found Sarah burning their marriage certificate in the kitchen stove, she told him everything and handed him Charlotte's proof. He stared, pale and shaking, then fled outside to vomit in the garden. Later, still trembling, he returned only long enough to move into the workshop permanently, leaving Sarah alone with Thomas and the child inside her. Daniel and Rebecca, 2 orphans brought to the settlement in 1865, had grown into teenagers by 1870. Daniel 15, Rebecca 13. Englehart had tried to keep them apart, but their bond only deepened. They met in secret in an old barn where winter supplies were stored, drawn to each other by something neither understood. As they pieced together scraps of memory, a house with blue shutters, a woman's voice singing German lullabies, the smell of baking bread on Sundays, they realized the truth. They were brother and sister, and Englehart was grooming them for the same fate as Sarah and William. The settlement began to crack. Some tried to flee, but Englehart had his allies, rough men from Philadelphia with no medical skill, only a taste for violence. The Yodas made it as far as Lancaster before being dragged back, Abraham's eyes swollen shut. His wife's lips split open. The message was clear. No one leaves. Others chose darker paths. Mary Stoltzfus, unable to bear the reality that she had unknowingly married her brother and given birth to 3 disfigured children, walked into the icy waters of Canogo Creek with stones sewn into her dress. Her body washed up 3 miles downstream. Engelhart called it an accident. Her husband Hans never spoke again, sitting motionless by the window each day, staring at nothing. Meanwhile, Engelhart's mind unraveled further. His lectures turned into fevered rants about racial purity and the noble sacrifices demanded by science. He spoke of expanding his experiment, creating satellite settlements across Pennsylvania to replicate his methods on a larger scale. He exchanged letters with doctors in Ohio and Indiana who shared his monstrous vision, urging them to start their own breeding programs. Charlotte knew time was running out. She contacted Frederick Schaefer, a journalist for the Lancaster Examiner investigating rumors of medical atrocities in rural communities. They agreed to meet at a tavern 10 miles from Harmonia Springs. She carried a satchel stuffed with copied documents that could destroy Engelhart, but she never reached the meeting place. 2 days later, her body was found in a ravine, her neck broken. Engelhart called it a tragic fall. The satchel and its papers were gone. But Charlotte had not been entirely silenced. Before setting out, she had mailed Schaefer some of her notes, enough to convince him that something unspeakable was festering in Harmonia Springs. And so, in early April 1871, as the Pennsylvania countryside bloomed with spring, a woman calling herself Elizabeth Morrison, ***. When she reached Lancaster, she was 53, her face lined and toughened from a lifetime of factory labor, her hands bearing the small, pale scars of decades spent in the clatter and heat of textile mills. She rented a modest room at the White Swan in the very place Engelhart himself had lodged some 15 years before, and quietly began her search for Harmonia Springs. Her approach was patient and calculated. She pored over property ledgers in the county courthouse, spoke with shopkeepers who had done business with the settlement, and even attended medical society gatherings where Engelhart's name, though seldom spoken, carried a certain hushed weight. From these scraps of conversation and public record, she began to piece together the truth. She learned of the settlement's self-imposed isolation, of strange cases involving children born with physical abnormalities, of families who seemed bound there for life, and of the quiet, unexplained death of a young woman named Charlotte Pennypacker. Every detail seemed to confirm what she had feared for more than a decade and a half. Elizabeth Morrison was a name she had borrowed. In reality, she was Mary Elizabeth Brennan, a mother who had been searching for her missing twins since the year 1841, 30 years earlier. She had been told a story meant to end her search before it began. Her babies, she was told, had died of cholera while she was trapped in a 16-hour shift at the mill. There had been official death certificates to small graves in a pauper's cemetery and closed caskets sealed, so they claimed, for fear of spreading the disease. She had accepted none of it. A mother knows. And the doctor's signature on the papers, C. Engelhart, meant nothing to her at the time. But the name clung to her memory, surfacing in her dreams like a shadow she could never shake. For 15 years she had done everything a poor, uneducated woman could to arm herself for the search. She learned to read and write. She studied legal codes and case records. She followed Engelhart's career through journal articles and newspaper clippings. She read his theories on hereditary optimization and discovered his ties to other physicians pursuing the same grim ambitions. She unearthed records of children acquired from poorhouses, sales bills in which human lives were listed alongside livestock and supplies, labeled only as specimens. Finally, through the help of a kindly Philadelphia clerk who remembered an odd case in which twin children were adopted out on the same day, each to a different family, she traced them here, to Harmonia Springs. It was April 15, 1871, when she finally arrived at the settlement gates. She had prepared for this moment with care, crafting a false identity as a distant Brennan relative in possession of forged documents about an inheritance in Ohio, an inheritance that supposedly required William's signature. Engelhart had his doubts, but his avarice outweighed them, and so she was allowed inside under the constant gaze of an escort. The first time she saw William, her body seemed to forget how to breathe. He was bent over a workbench in the carpentry shop, his back toward her, but the set of his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head in concentration, the curl of his hair at the neck, they all belonged to her father. When he turned, the resemblance struck her like a physical blow. Her mother's eyes stared back at her, her brother's nose, her son, her baby, now a man worn thin by a life she could barely imagine. The ever-watchful Roth, Englehart's hulking assistant, stood close by throughout their meeting. She kept to her part, speaking of the inheritance, producing her falsified papers, and expressing concern for her nephew's well-being. William's answers were muted, his gaze often drifting toward a house at the far eastern edge of the settlement, where a young pregnant woman lingered in the doorway, her expression taut with unease. That night, Elizabeth waited until the small hours, knowing from her earlier observations that the guard's vigilance waned after midnight. Slipping out of the communal hall assigned to her, she followed the dirt path to the eastern house. Her heart thudded with each step. When the door opened, she nearly cried out. Standing before her was the reflection of her own younger self 30 years earlier. The same dark, lustrous hair she had worn before the mills and grief had turned it gray. The same fine-boned features, the same unconscious tilt of the head when puzzled. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Please, let me in. I'm not who you think I am. There's something you need to know about William, about yourself, about where you came from." The young woman, too weary to resist, stepped aside. In the dim flicker of a lone candle, Elizabeth began. She told her of being a young widow at 23, left with twin infants after her husband's death in a factory accident. She told her of the well-dressed man who had arrived at her tenement, claiming to work for a charitable society that found homes for destitute children. He had promised education, comfort, and opportunity, things Elizabeth could not hope to give at the time. She was to reclaim them when her situation improved. She signed papers she could not read, but when she returned 2 weeks later with the first meager sum she had scraped together, the office was gone, emptied overnight. No one knew or would say where her children had gone. She reached into her bodice and drew out a locket she had worn close for 3 decades. Inside were 2 tiny painted portraits, an infant boy with dark hair, and his sister with lighter hair. Both had the same unmistakable eyes. "I had this made before he took you," she murmured, voice breaking. "It cost a week's wages, but I needed to have something, anything to remember you by. Look, do you see? They're William's eyes. They're your eyes." The young woman's face crumpled. Then came the sobs, deep, shaking, unstoppable, as if a lifetime of grief had suddenly been given permission to spill free. ***. William stumbled out of the workshop, restless from another sleepless night. The cold night air bit at his skin, but the sight that met him stopped him in his tracks. Standing there, framed in the pale moonlight, was their mother, his mother. Despite the long years apart, despite the suffering that had shaped their faces, recognition came instantly. The familiar curve of her hands, the cadence in her voice, it struck something raw and instinctive deep inside him. "My babies," Elizabeth breathed, pulling both her children into a trembling embrace. "My beautiful babies. What has he done to you?" Her voice cracked with equal parts love and grief. But the reunion did not go unseen. Young Daniel, the orphan boy barely in his teens, had slipped out for a secret meeting with Rebecca. Passing by the workshop windows, he froze at the sight of the 3 huddled figures. He didn't understand the meaning of what he saw, only that it mattered greatly. And so, he ran through the dark streets to the one man he trusted, old Heinrich Weaver, whose watchful eyes had long harbored doubts about Dr. Englehart's work. Within an hour, the quiet settlement was stirring. Word spread like fire through dry grass. Families emerged from their homes despite the late hour and the ironclad rules against gatherings. Murmurs swelled into shouts. The great bell in the meeting hall began to toll, its bronze voice rolling across the valley. Englehart appeared at the doorway of the medical facility, not the composed, commanding physician the settlers had once followed, but a cornered creature. A pistol glinted in his right hand, and in the other he gripped a bottle of chloroform. Behind him stood his 3 remaining assistants, each armed. "Return to your homes immediately." He barked, his voice sharp with desperation. "This assembly is unlawful. You're spreading hereditary contamination just by being here." Elizabeth stepped forward. Her voice was steady, fueled by the unbreakable resolve of a mother who had her children stolen. "Tell them the truth, Engelhart," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "Tell them what you've done. Tell them you've been forcing brothers to marry sisters. Tell them you've bred human beings like livestock." The crowd roared in outrage. Someone hurled a stone, shattering a laboratory window. Another voice rang out, crying of the children buried on the hillside. The families ruined by his twisted experiments. Engelhart's face twisted. He raised his pistol, aiming directly at Elizabeth. "You ignorant woman," he spat. "You would have left them to rot in poverty and ignorance. I gave them purpose. Their suffering will advance human knowledge. A century from now, my work will be vindicated." William didn't hesitate. As Engelhart's finger tightened on the trigger, he lunged, shoving his mother aside. The gun fired. The bullet struck William in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Sarah screamed, falling to her knees to press her hands against the wound, blood seeping hot between her fingers. The sight of blood shattered the last threads of restraint in the crowd. With a unified cry, they surged forward, overwhelming Engelhart's assistants in a furious rush. The doctor fled inside, bolting the door behind him. But the settlers, now a full mob, grabbed axes from the workshop and hacked their way inside. They found Engelhart in his laboratory, surrounded by charts, medical drawings, and glass jars containing the preserved remains of infants born grotesquely deformed. What followed would later be disputed in the courts for years. It seemed Engelhart had prepared for such a moment. Containers of chloroform and ether had been arranged throughout the room, chemicals that, when ignited together, would unleash a devastating fire. Whether he meant to destroy the evidence or obliterate everyone inside will never be known. The explosion rocked the valley, the blast audible in Lancaster, 15 miles away. Flames erupted, leaping 50 feet into the air, consuming the building, the records, and every fragment of Engelhart's life's work. When the fire finally cooled, only charred ruins remained. Engelhart's body was found in the wreckage, unrecognizable, identified solely by the melted frame of his pocket watch. The fire raged in Harmonia Springs for 2 days. By the time the Lancaster Fire Brigade arrived, there was nothing left of the medical facility to save. But the settlers had acted quickly before the flames spread. Led by Sarah and Elizabeth, they broke into Engelhart's office, snatching documents, ledgers, and the horrifying genealogical charts that exposed the scope of his atrocities. On the morning of April 18, 1871, county officials arrived to a shattered community. The destruction was not merely in the blackened timbers of burned houses. It was in the hollow eyes of the survivors, in the way some clutched their children tightly, while others sat staring at the dirt. Among them were children whose twisted limbs and distorted features now had a terrible explanation. Judge Harrison Fulton of the Lancaster County Court, a man seasoned by decades of grim cases, led the initial investigation. He thought himself ready for anything, but as the rescued evidence was laid before him, the forged records, the breeding charts, the testimonies, he realized he had never encountered anything so monstrous. The evidence, the files, the records of purchased children, the carefully arranged incestuous marriages was enough to disturb even the most hardened investigator. In his first report to the state authorities in Harrisburg, he used words like unconscionable, monstrous, and beyond the pale of human decency. William survived the gunshot wound, though the damage to his left arm was permanent. It would never work as it once had. As he recovered, he and Sarah were forced to confront an unbearable reality: what to do with their marriage, their family, their very identities. They were bound as husband and wife, yet also brother and sister. They had 3 surviving children. Thomas, the eldest at 12, bore severe deformities that made him an object of constant stares. The younger 2 were slightly less afflicted, but still showed the mark of genetic damage. The child Sarah had been carrying was gone lost too, a miscarriage brought on by the shock and grief of learning the truth. The legal situation was a tangle. Technically, their marriage was void. Siblings could not be legally wed. Yet if the union was dissolved, their children would be declared illegitimate, stripping them of what little legal and social protection they had. In a decision he later called the hardest of his career, Judge Fulton ruled that these marriages would remain valid under the law. Though couples were free to separate if they wished, most chose to part ways. The financial scaffolding that had held up Englehart's work collapsed under scrutiny. Investigators traced the money back to a secretive circle of wealthy eugenicists, including prominent Philadelphia businessmen and a sitting state senator. These men had convinced themselves that the future of the nation depended on producing a pure white American bloodline, and they saw poor German and Irish immigrants as expendable material for their experiment. The scandal reached dangerously high into Pennsylvania's social and political elite. 3 separate congressional investigations were launched, but none reached a conclusion. Each dissolved abruptly, as if by invisible hand. Court documents vanished, witnesses withdrew testimony or disappeared altogether. The state senator named in the scandal died suddenly, officially from a heart attack, though his personal physician had declared him perfectly healthy only days earlier. By the close of 1871, Harmonia Springs was empty, the families scattered across the country, most taking new names to bury their history. The Zimmermans relocated to Illinois. The Yoders melted into the growing German enclaves of Wisconsin. The Weavers were whispered to have fled to Canada. Wherever they went, they carried the weight of their past, what had been done to them, and what they had unknowingly done to their own children. After months of agonizing, William and Sarah decided they could no longer live as husband and wife, though they could not erase the bond they shared. William left for Ohio, finding work as a carpenter under a false name. Sarah moved with the children to Baltimore, where her mother, Elizabeth, had connections in the textile mills. To explain their situation, she claimed to be a war widow. This story excused the absence of her children's father and offered a plausible reason for their deformities, which she attributed to the hardships of war. In 1874, tragedy struck again. Thomas Brennan died at only 15. His body, weakened by the genetic damage from his parents' relationship, simply could not endure. He was buried under the name Thomas Graber, using Sarah's maiden name. His gravestone listed only his name and dates, with no mention of his parents. Sarah stood beside the grave with Elizabeth, both women in tears, mourning the boy who had never been given the chance for a normal life. The younger children faced similar fates. Many died in early adulthood, their bodies unable to cope with the genetic burden. Those who survived were often sterile, nature's cruel safeguard against the continuation of the damage. They lived quietly, hidden from the world, some in asylums, others under the care of religious orders that asked no questions. Two of the few to escape a worse fate were Daniel and Rebecca, teenage siblings who discovered their true relation in time to stop their marriage from being consummated. A Quaker family in Philadelphia took them in, fully aware of their past, but believing in redemption and fresh starts. They grew up openly as siblings, each marrying outside the community and having healthy children. They never spoke of Harmonia Springs again, and their children never learned of the horror their parents had narrowly avoided. Elizabeth Brennan lived until 1878, spending her last years helping Sarah raise the surviving grandchildren. On her deathbed, she extracted a promise from Sarah that she would record everything so that the truth of Harmonia Springs would not vanish completely. Sarah kept that promise, writing a detailed account and locking it away in a safety deposit box, instructing that it remain sealed for 50 years. When the box was opened in 1921, the world had changed. Eugenics was no longer the obsession of a shadowy few. It was a respected movement, championed by governments around the globe. Sarah's story, lacking physical evidence and told long after the fact, was dismissed as the rambling of a woman broken by trauma. The documents and artifacts that might have supported her words had long since been destroyed, hidden, or lost forever. It would take the unimaginable horrors of World War II and the atrocities committed under the Nazi eugenics programs for the world to truly grasp the kind of darkness that had once descended upon a quiet valley in Pennsylvania. Harmonia Springs, now exists only as a faded name on outdated maps, its history swallowed by time and reclaimed by the encroaching forest. Those who wander through the area on hiking trails sometimes stumble upon fragments of the past, a lone foundation stone, a corroded piece of medical apparatus, or brittle human bones from a long-forgotten hillside cemetery, where wooden markers have long since rotted away. The spring itself still bubbles from the limestone bedrock, its mineral-heavy water running clear, but no one dares drink from it. Local folklore whispers of strange, mournful cries drifting through the trees after dark, of distorted shadows moving in the moonlight, and of a curse that clings to the land. Yet the truth is far more disturbing than any ghost story. Harmonia Springs was never haunted by the supernatural. It was poisoned by human ambition, by the ruthless conviction that science could shape a flawless version of humanity through calculated breeding, and by the arrogance of powerful men willing to experiment on the powerless. Children suffered and died there, families were torn apart, and entire lives were sacrificed at the altar of a warped vision of perfection. Locked away deep within the National Archives in Washington are 3 plain boxes labeled simply with a clearance restriction sealed until 2071. Inside lie the surviving records of Harmonia Springs, Sarah's handwritten journal, scorched fragments of Dr. Englehart's notes salvaged from a fire, sworn testimonies from court proceedings, and photographs, grim, heart-wrenching photographs of children born from forced unions between people who never knew they were siblings. What makes this history truly horrifying is not just that it occurred, but that it was not an isolated case. Evidence has since surfaced suggesting that similar settlements existed in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, all linked to the same shadowy network of eugenicists who funded Englehart's work. How many other places like Harmonia Springs were there? How many other families had their lives stolen in the name of genetic improvement? How many other Engleharts carried out their experiments in secrecy, far from public eyes? The last survivor known to have been born in Harmonia Springs passed away in 1943. Margaret Yoda, born Margaret Stoltz. She had escaped the worst of the deformities that plagued most children there, and spent her entire adult life in silence within a Catholic convent in Maryland. Only on her deathbed did she confide her past to a young nun, who wrote it down and hid the account in the convent's archives. Margaret's testimony confirmed every detail in Sarah's journal, and added pieces that made the truth even more harrowing. She spoke of other sites, just like Harmonia Springs' other experiments. Other children born into incestuous unions without ever knowing their true blood ties. She remembered seeing letters from out-of-state doctors, exchanging results, as if they were breeding cattle, noting which traits succeeded and which failed. She recalled Englehart displaying jars filled with preserved fetuses to select visitors, proudly pointing out deformities as if they were rare specimens of beauty, instead of the remains of dead infants. Even worse, Margaret revealed that some families who fled Harmonia Springs were hunted down by the agents of the eugenics network. Some were silenced with money, others simply vanished. The Zimmerman family, who had escaped to Illinois, were found dead in their farmhouse in 1873. The official verdict was a murder-suicide by poisoning, but Margaret knew otherwise. They had been speaking openly about going to the press and exposing everything. The complete truth of Harmonia Springs will likely never be known. Too many papers were burned, too many witnesses were erased, and too many influential people had everything to lose if the experiments were ever brought fully into the light. What we do know is enough to haunt the conscience. Between 1856 and 1871, no fewer than 40 families were subjected to deliberate genetic manipulation. At least 20 couples had been deceived into marrying their own brothers or sisters. More than 60 children were born with devastating deformities. And this was only one settlement, overseen by one doctor. In one dark chapter of a much larger story, the final piece of physical evidence emerged unexpectedly in 1995, when construction workers cutting a new highway through Lancaster County uncovered a mass grave. 17 children's remains were unearthed, each showing signs of severe congenital deformities. DNA tests confirmed they were all closely related, the results of incestuous pairings. The state quietly reburied them in an unmarked location, known to only a handful of officials. But perhaps the most chilling artifact surfaced in 2003, when the estate of a prominent Philadelphia family yielded a letter written by Engelhart himself, shortly before his death. In it, he made a disturbing claim. His work had been merely the first step. "The seed has been planted," he wrote. "Others will continue what I have begun. The purification of the American bloodline is too important to be halted by the squeamishness of the ignorant. In time, my methods will be vindicated, my vision realized." Harmonia Springs, then, was not the end of something, it was the beginning. So what truly happened in that valley? Was it the work of a single obsessed man or one branch of a far-reaching, coordinated effort we still know almost nothing about? Perhaps the answer is buried in archives still sealed, in documents destroyed long ago, or in the graves of those who never lived to tell their stories. If this tale has unsettled you, share it with others who seek out the hidden, darker corners of history. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are not spirits or demons, they are people, wielding power, unrestrained, and convinced they know what is best for humanity.